So I'm still working on converting the Make Human plugin for Blender into Godot 4, and I was trying to figure out the position of the vertices so I can build the skeleton, and I did figure that out, so I'll be talking about that next time once I get the rotation. But in the meantime, I found out about the make tangent and generate normal functions in the SurfaceTool, and that allows me to generate the shading for all the shape keys. Previously, I was using the basis shading and applying it to all of them. So the import mesh only has about 8 different keys. So I had to programmatically generate this from the data files instead, so I didn't have to export them all from Blender individually. I have a link to the project in the description if you want to download the source code, and I'll show you how I got this to work. So first, you'll want to save the blend file mesh as a separate resource. As you can see, you can just drag the blend file directly into a new scene, and then right-click Make Local to edit the nodes. However, this makes a new copy of all of the data in the scene, and it won't update automatically, so instead you'll want to double-click on the blend file to open up the advanced import settings, then click to the yellow box, which is your mesh, and enable Save to File, and then navigate to the location you want to save it as, and you can use the .resource.res, or you can use .mesh. It seems to work no matter what extension. So save that and let it re-import. So now this resource file will update automatically when you re-import the scene, and it also is much smaller, so you'll be able to upload to GitHub. And then I have a hide helpers material, which I made last time. And this sets all of the helper geometry to transparent, so you can see the human form. And then we still have the default blend shapes available as well. Initially, I was trying to calculate the vertex positions of the mesh once the blend shapes were applied so that I could build the skeleton. And I did have good success with that, but I'll show you that in the next video. I still need to get the bone rotations working. But I learned some interesting things while I was testing. Then I'll attach a built-in script to the main node, and I like to use the tool mode because the editor already has lighting and the camera set up, so it's just easier to work with for testing. So I'll make a boolean to refresh and override the set function, so it calls the update function every time you toggle the refresh. And I'll add an update function as well. I'll just print updating for now. And then you'll want to reopen the scene. And now if you hit refresh and open the output, you can see that it's printing the updating string. First, I found the create debug tangents function on the mesh instance 3D node to create gizmos at every vertex. So I thought that would be helpful for finding the locations. So I'll make another function to make the debug tangents, and then on the human call create debug tangents, and then in the update function I'll call that. And then if I run the update, you can see that it's generated a new node, and we have the X, Y, and Z axis indicated for every single vertex. So that's pretty cool. However, if I increase the shape key and delete the debug tangents and update this again, you can see that it still generates the debug tangents on the original mesh and doesn't take the blend shapes into account. So this was not helpful for creating the bone positions. So I'll go ahead and delete the debug tangents and reset the shape keys and comment out the function call. Next, I tried the MeshDataTool, which provides access to individual vertices in a mesh and allows you to read and edit the vertex data. So that sounded pretty good. And you'll use create from surface and pass in a array mesh and a surface. And it has to be using the primitive triangles type, which the make human model does, so that's not an issue. So I'll make a new function to test the MeshDataTool, and I'll make a new variable equal to MeshDataTool.new, and then I'll create from surface using the human.mesh on surface 0. Now I'll make a new mesh instance 3D child under the root node and rename it. And I'll set the mesh to a new array mesh, and I'll move it over some. Then in the script, I'll use the MeshDataTool commit to surface function and pass the testmesh.mesh. And in the update function, I'll call the test MeshDataTool. So now when I refresh, it generates a copy of the original mesh, as you can see. And if I copy the hide helpers material, you can see that it has the shading as well, but the shape keys were not transferred. So And if I were to turn up the shape key all the way and reset this mesh and refresh, you can see that the original shape keys have not been translated. It's still the original base mesh. So this does not work for creating the skeleton. So the MeshDataTool does not have a way to reference the blend shapes, but I did find the SurfaceTool, which is similar to the MeshDataTool, but there's a create from blend shape function where you can pass in a blend shape name. So I'll get rid of the MeshDataTool and make a new function for the SurfaceTool. And make a new variable equal to SurfaceTool.new. And I'll use the SurfaceTool create from blend shape on the human.mesh on surface 0. And you can drag the blend shape name directly from the editor. Just get rid of the blend shapes slash and call SurfaceTool commit on the test mesh.mesh. So I need to set the mesh to a new array mesh and refresh and drag the helper geometry. So now you can see that it was able to create the young African male shape key, but I have this set to 0.4. I was hoping that I would be able to add multiple blend shapes at different percents, but this only does the max expression of the shape key, so it won't change if I regenerate it. So that wasn't going to work for the bones either, and I did find from Lex Partisan, who made Go Make Human Dot, he was working on this as well, a similar problem, and the answer is basically just to interpolate between the target blend shape and the original mesh, which is what I ended up doing. So I didn't need the SurfaceTool helper at all. However, I found in SurfaceTool that there's a generate normals and generate tangents function, and this takes into account the smooth groups, so it has the smoothing set to 1 by default on the normals. So I'll use that to generate the shading for my shape keys. So last time when I imported the shape keys, I just used the tangents and normals from the base mesh to generate all of the shape keys. So this made the shading a little off. So if I increase the Same shape key in both. You can see that the shading is different on the chest because it's using the default tangents and normals. So I'll reset those, and I'll just get rid of the normals and tangents completely, since I'll be generating them with the SurfaceTool instead. And I want to rename the generated mesh to human unshaded. And then I can run the local scene to regenerate the mesh. And now I'll need to drag the new unshaded mesh into the export mesh 3D node. So now you can see we have all of the shape keys available, but they have no shading at all. And now if I go back to the test scene and set the human mesh to the unshaded for the import, and I'll set the blend shape name, so it's keeping the blend shapes from the original mesh as well. So I'll go ahead and reload the test scene, and now just the shape keys from the generated mesh are there. And so I'll change the shape key name to one of these. And if I refresh, you can see that it's generated the mesh upside down and facing backwards, so that's not what we wanted. I'm also going to set the test mesh dot mesh equals new array mesh, so it will clear that mesh automatically. So if we refresh, you can see it's there. And I'll go ahead and set the test mesh surface override material to the helpers material using load on surface 0. So now if I refresh again, you can see that it applies the material, however it's still upside down, and that's because the generated mesh is using relative blend shape mode, and the original mesh is using normalized blend shape mode. So I talked about the difference between relative and normalized in the last video, but basically I'll need to make the generated mesh normalized for the SurfaceTool to work with the blend shapes correctly. So in the script, I'll set the blend shape mode to normalized, and in the process shape keys, when I set the new shape vertex at I, I'll add the mesh arrays vertex at I as well. And now if I rerun the script, the export mesh is now normalized, and the sliders still all work. And if I go back to the test scene now, this should automatically update, and if I hit refresh, now you can see the Asian child blend shape has been created. So I can change the shape key to any of the other keys and hit refresh. So this is now working with the normalized generated mesh. Now to create the shading, I need to call the generate normals and generate tangents functions. So you can set the smooth group to -1 for flat shading, but it's set to 0 by default for smooth normals, which takes the surrounding vertices into account, and it just makes the shading more realistic. You can also generate the LODs, which is the level of detail. That's for rendering lower vertices at further distance, since you can't see as much of them anyway, and it helps with performance. But I'm not going to worry about the LODs right now. And I don't need to flip the tangents. I'm not sure how that would be helpful, but that's set to false by default. So you need to generate the tangents after you create from blend shape, but before you call commit. So SurfaceTool, generate normals, and SurfaceTool, generate tangents, and save it. So now when I refresh, you can see that it generates the shading properly. And if I compare it to the import mesh, you can see that the chest and face look the same now, so that worked very well. Now I need to generate all of the shape keys and add them back into the original mesh using the array mesh create function. Now I want to iterate over all of the blend shapes and merge the final shaded mesh back into the original model. So I'll make a new 3D scene and add the unshaded human mesh. I'll go ahead and rename it and add the material. And this will be the generate shading file. And I'll attach a built-in script for the scene. I wanted to keep this separate from the shape keys because I didn't know if it would run out of memory processing it once I added all of the keys, so I wanted it to be separated into multiple files. And I'll copy the test SurfaceTool function to the new class since I know that it's working. Rename this to process shape key, and I'll take the blend shape name as a parameter and replace the string. Now I'll make a new mesh variable from array mesh, and use the surface tool to commit to the new mesh and return that instead. Change this to point at the unshaded human.mesh. And in the ready function, I'll make a new mesh variable equals process shape key, and you can drag in any of the shape keys. Like so. And then I'll use the resource saver to save the new mesh at human.resource. And now if I run this, it did generate the resource, and I can drag it into the scene. And set the surface material override. So you can see that is still working as it did. Now I want to use the unshaded mesh as the basis. So instead of setting the mesh to process shape key, I'll make a new array mesh, and I'll get the surface arrays from the mesh, and I'll set the blend shape mode to normalized, and call add surface from arrays. Without the blend arrays passed. Set the mesh arrays variable and save it as the human.resource. And now if I run this, you can see that the export has changed to the base human with no blend keys. So now I want to merge the blend shapes into the base model. So I'll need to make a blend shapes array, and this is for the add surface from arrays function. This is it's an array of mesh arrays in the mesh array format, but only the array vertex, normal, and tangents are set. Everything else is null, and the normal and tangent are only set if they are in the base array. So instead of committing the surface tool to a mesh, you can use surface tool commit to arrays, which uses the same format as for the array mesh add surface from arrays. So I'll go ahead and make a commit array equals surface tool dot commit to arrays, and I'll make a current blend shape equal to an empty array, and then I'll resize the array to the mesh array max, which is 14, I believe, and then I'll set the blend shape at array vertex equal to the commit array at array vertex. And instead of returning the new mesh, I'll append this to the blend shapes. And for each shape key, I'll need to add the blend shape name to the mesh as well. So I'll add that to process shape key and then move the new mesh to the top. So now I should be able to call process shape key and add the blend arrays as a parameter. But if I run this, the mesh throws an error. You can see that it's no longer visible. And it took me a while to figure out what the problem was, but finally I realized that the surface array's mesh was a different size than the commit array vertex. So if I print out the size of the commit array and the mesh arrays on the vertex, you can see the original mesh has 29,800 vertices and the generated mesh has 21,800. So I tested some other shape keys as well, just to make sure it wasn't generating a different number, and it's always 21,833 vertices on the blend shapes. So because the number of vertices is different, that means the arrays don't match up and it just doesn't display anything. And I did test this in the vertex finder. I made a new one for the SurfaceTool because I thought maybe it was indexing them to their proper Blender index, since the number was much lower. The unique index has 19,000, but I just tried it anyway, and I can see this is the SurfaceTool one, and this is the indexed mesh. So you can see that the vertexes are not lining up. So essentially I figured out that I needed to add a basis shape key into the unshaded mesh from the import mesh. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then the number of vertices in the mesh should be the same as the blend shapes. So in the import shape keys scene, I'll make a new function to make the basis shape. And first I'll need to add the blend shape name to the mesh. Then I'll make the new shape array equals an empty array and resize the array to the mesh.arrayMax, and then I'll set the new shape at mesh array vertex equals the mesh arrays at mesh array vertex. And then I'll add the new shape to the blend arrays. And I'll call this before I process the other shape keys. So it will be added as the very first shape key at index 0. So now if I run this, this is the import shape keys. So now you can see in the export mesh, the basis shape key has been added, and when you turn it up and down, it doesn't change at all since I just used the vertexes from the base mesh and didn't use the import data. So, and all of these other shape keys do still work, so that's good. And now in the generate shading scene, in process shape key, after I make the commit array, I'll check if the shape name equals basis. Otherwise, create the blend shape array and commit it. So here, I'll set the mesh arrays. Instead of getting from the unshaded human surface, I'll declare the mesh arrays as an empty array, and if the shape name is basis, I'll set mesh arrays equal to the commit array, and since the basis has the normals and tangents now from generate, I'll set the current blend shape, array normals, and tangents as well. To the commit array. So now it has all of the data. It needs to properly shade the model. And before I add the shape key, I'll process the basis key. Also, I don't need to make a new SurfaceTool every time, so I'll just declare that at the top, and I think it resets the mesh when you call create from blend shape, but either way you can use SurfaceTool clear at the end to reset it. And I need to move the add blend shape into the else statement. Since I don't want to add a blend shape for the basis, I just want to set the mesh arrays. So now if I run this, and move the mesh over, you can see that it has generated the mesh, and I can still use the hide helpers material, and it has the I need to reload it because it has some extra shape keys. So now it just has the shape key that I added. But you can see that the shading is working. Now I want to add the rest of the blend shapes. So in the ready function, I'll get the blend shape index in unshaded human dot get blend shape count, and I'll call the process shape key function with the index, and in the process shape key I'll set the parameter to the index and get the name from the unshaded mesh dot get blend shape name at the blend shape index. And now if I run the script, it does take a while, but when it's done, you can see that it's generated all of the shape keys, and the shading looks good on all of them. So that's how you generate shading from a mesh. And that's all for now. Thank you for watching and have a great day.